The Thucydides Trap: Why the World's Two Most Powerful Nations Are Terrified of History Repeating Itself. This is Amerixa Daily, and today, I want to talk to you about something that sounds like an ancient history lesson, but might actually decide the future of the entire world. Imagine two nations so economically connected that they trade trillions of dollars with each other, build each other's products, depend on each other's technology, and still move closer and closer toward confrontation. Think about that for a moment. That's the paradox. The more America and China become connected, the more dangerous their rivalry seems to become. And buried inside that contradiction is a phrase that keeps appearing in meetings between world leaders, military strategists, and intelligence analysts. The Thucydides Trap. A theory born from a war that happened 2,500 years ago, now shaping conversations between modern superpowers. Beat. And once you understand it, you may never look at global politics the same way again. 1. Paradox Setup. Let's start with the contradiction itself. Right now, the United States and China are the two largest economies on Earth. Together, they account for nearly 40% of the global economy. Every single day, goods worth billions of dollars move between the two countries. American companies manufacture products in China. Chinese factories rely on American consumers. Financial markets in New York react instantly to policies announced in Beijing. Their economies are deeply intertwined. And yet, the relationship between these two nations has become increasingly tense. Trade wars, semiconductor bans, cybersecurity accusations, military exercises around Taiwan, naval confrontations in the South China Sea, artificial intelligence competition, space technology rivalry. Both nations are preparing for economic separation while still depending on each other more than almost any two countries in history. Here's what makes this so strange. Historically, countries that traded heavily with each other were supposed to avoid war because conflict would damage both sides. But today, many analysts fear the exact opposite may be happening. The deeper the competition becomes, the greater the risk of confrontation. And that fear has become so serious that Chinese President Xi Jinping directly brought up something called the Thucydides Trap during discussions with Donald Trump in Beijing. Not tariffs. Not trade deficits. Not military budgets. History itself. Beat. Because according to this theory, when a rising power threatens to replace an existing dominant power, conflict becomes dangerously likely. Not because either side wants war, but because fear, suspicion, and competition slowly push both sides toward it anyway. And suddenly, the most powerful countries on Earth start behaving less like rational business partners, and more like historical rivals trapped inside a repeating cycle. Here's the unsettling part. This has happened before. Again. And again. And again. 2. The obvious answer, and why it's wrong. Now, at first glance, the solution seems obvious. If war would economically destroy both countries, why not simply cooperate? Why not just agree to coexist peacefully? That sounds reasonable. In fact, most people assume economic interdependence naturally prevents conflict. Because on a small scale, that logic works. Let's use a simple analogy. Imagine two business partners who depend on each other to survive. One supplies raw materials. The other sells finished products. If they fight, both lose money. So naturally, they avoid conflict. Simple. But here's where that logic begins to break down at the national level. Because countries don't only compete economically. They compete for influence. For military dominance. For technological superiority. For control over global systems. And most importantly, for security. Here's where it gets fascinating. The Thucydides Trap isn't really about aggression. It's about fear. The original idea comes from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who studied the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta around 2,500 years ago. Athens was rising rapidly. Its economy expanded. Its military grew stronger. Its influence spread across the region. And Sparta, the existing dominant power, became increasingly afraid of losing its position. According to Thucydides, that fear itself made war almost inevitable. Not because either side necessarily wanted conflict, but because every action started looking threatening to the other side. A defensive military buildup looked offensive. Economic expansion looked like domination. Strategic alliances looked like encirclement. And little by little, distrust consumed the relationship. Now think about the United States and China. When China expands its navy, Beijing says it's protecting trade routes. Washington sees military expansion. When America restricts semiconductor exports, Washington says it's protecting national security. China sees containment. Every move becomes interpreted through suspicion. And that's why simple economic logic stops working. Because once fear enters the system, even cooperation begins to feel dangerous. Here's the twist. The real danger isn't hatred. It's misunderstanding. 3. Layer by layer reveal. Layer 1, the ancient pattern. Let's go deeper. Harvard political scientist Graham Allison popularized the term Thucydides' trap after studying 16 major historical cases where a rising power challenged a dominant one. And what he found was chilling. In 12 out of those 16 cases, the rivalry ended in war. Think about that for a moment. Imperial Germany rising against Britain before World War I. The growing rivalry between Japan and the United States before Pearl Harbor. Even the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union carried elements of this pattern. History repeatedly shows the same dangerous dynamic. A rising power wants greater influence. The dominant power fears losing control. Tensions escalate. Mistrust grows. And suddenly, even small incidents become incredibly dangerous. A naval collision. A trade sanction. A cyber attack. One wrong calculation. And history begins repeating itself. But here's where the modern version becomes far more complicated. Because unlike previous rivalries, America and China are economically tied together in ways the ancient world could never imagine. Which creates an entirely new paradox. Layer 2, the economic contradiction. Here's where it gets fascinating. China owns massive amounts of American debt. At different points, China has held over $800 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. In simple terms, China lends enormous amounts of money to the United States government. Now think about how strange that is. One nation is financially supporting the very country it increasingly views as its biggest strategic competitor. That's like funding the operations of someone you may someday confront. But here's the twist. China can't easily stop. Because if China suddenly dumped American debt, it could damage its own economy too. Its exports would suffer. Its financial reserves could lose value. Global markets might panic. And the United States would also suffer massive instability. So both countries are locked into a relationship where competition and dependence exist at the exact same time. The world's biggest rivals are financially connected almost like business partners. And that changes everything. This isn't Sparta and Athens anymore. This is something humanity has never fully experienced before. A geopolitical rivalry fused together by globalization. Which raises an even bigger question. If both nations know conflict would hurt everyone, why does tension keep increasing anyway? Layer 3, the technology war. Because underneath the economic relationship lies a much deeper battle. Technology. Artificial intelligence. Semiconductors. Quantum computing. Military innovation. The next global superpower may not simply be the country with the largest army, but the country controlling the technologies of the future. And that's why semiconductor restrictions became such a major issue. Advanced chips power everything. Missiles, AI systems, supercomputers, surveillance networks, modern warfare itself. When the United States restricted China's access to advanced semiconductor technology, Washington described it as national security protection. But Beijing interpreted it differently, as an attempt to slow China's rise. And suddenly, economic policy transformed into strategic confrontation. This is no longer just about trade. It's about who controls the future. And once nations begin believing their survival depends on winning that future, compromise becomes much harder. Because every advantage gained by one side feels like a threat to the other. Layer 4, the human story. Now let's bring this down to one ordinary person. Imagine an American school teacher named Sarah. Sarah has a retirement account invested in index funds. Those funds contain shares in major American technology companies. Many of those companies manufacture products in China. Some rely heavily on Chinese consumers. Some depend on Chinese supply chains. At the same time, Sarah watches news reports warning about China becoming America's greatest geopolitical rival. She hears discussions about military tensions around Taiwan, cybersecurity threats, trade wars, artificial intelligence competition. And here's the strange part. Her financial future is tied to the success of the very economic relationship many politicians increasingly describe as dangerous. If US-China trade collapses completely, global markets could crash. Her retirement savings could suffer. But if China continues rising economically and technologically, America fears losing strategic dominance. So Sarah exists inside the paradox too. Just like millions of ordinary people across both countries. A factory worker in China depends on American consumers. An American investor depends on Chinese manufacturing. Both societies are economically connected, even while political distrust grows stronger. And that's what makes this rivalry so historically unique. The competition is happening between economies that are deeply fused together. Which means a conflict wouldn't just affect governments. It would ripple through the lives of billions of ordinary people. 4. The mind shift conclusion. So what is the real lesson behind the Thucydides trap? It's not that war between the United States and China is inevitable. Even Xi Jinping himself has repeatedly argued that it is not inevitable. And many American officials avoid using the phrase entirely because they fear believing in historical destiny can become dangerous on its own. The real lesson is something deeper. Power transitions are psychologically destabilizing. When one nation rises rapidly, the existing power naturally becomes anxious. Every action becomes interpreted through fear. Every policy becomes viewed as strategic positioning. Every misunderstanding becomes magnified. And history shows that civilizations often stumble into conflict not because leaders consciously choose destruction, but because mistrust quietly takes control of the relationship. Here's where it gets truly unsettling. The modern world is now so interconnected that humanity may be running a completely new experiment. Never before have two rival superpowers been so economically dependent on each other. Never before has technological competition moved this fast. Never before have global supply chains linked billions of people together so tightly. Which means the world may now be testing a question history has never fully answered. Can two great powers compete intensely, without eventually colliding? Because the Thucydides trap is ultimately not just about China and America. It's about human nature. Fear. Power. Insecurity. and the terrifying possibility that societies can become trapped inside historical patterns they barely understand. But maybe history is not destiny. Maybe awareness itself changes the outcome. Maybe recognizing the trap is the first step toward avoiding it. Or maybe humanity keeps believing it's more advanced than the civilizations before it. Right until history repeats itself again. Beat. And once you see global politics through that lens, every trade war, every military exercise, every technology ban, and every diplomatic meeting suddenly feels very different. Because beneath all the headlines, two superpowers may be trying to answer one ancient question. Can history finally be broken? This is Amerixa Daily. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping our world. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous battles begin long before the first shot is fired.